happened to me. I came down from a size 14 and I can slip into a 7 or a 9.
I tried other programs, but this is the only one that worked for me.
Give yourself a Valentine gift of love. Weight Loss Clinic can make it happen.
Oh, it makes her feel great.
Good morning. On the program this morning, I've got Hugh Kaufman of the U.S. Environmental Protection Association. The name might not mean very much to you, but he's the nadir of the environmental protection business in the United States, and he's sticking his nose in by invitation to Canadian affairs. Kaufman, for your benefit, is the guy who blew the whistle on what was being done with the superfund in the United States. And in case you're not thinking American this morning, the United States is the country that drops acid rain on us and kills all our lakes in northeastern and eastern Canada. And we do a little bit of retribution by dropping some acid rain and garbage on them. This fella Kaufman is actually here to help us. And you'll hear more of him on the program. In town today, at last, is that fellow Pierre De Bane, the Minister of Fisheries, who pays great attention to all the problems on the East Coast. And yesterday he was talking depressingly about the West Coast.
The salmon catch on the Pacific coast was something like 160,000 tons. And it could go down as low as 30,000 tons next year. So we have obviously have to stop that decline.
Now that's a self-evident truth, and the minister will be here tomorrow morning. But today we have John Fraser, Tory MP and Fisheries Minister, Fisheries critic for the opposition, who's going to give us the Tory plan for the survival of our very much threatened salmon fishing industry. Before we get down to real business, so let's have a look at the comic opera in northeastern British Columbia on Paul Watson's wolf hunt. He's hunting for the wolves to save them from Elliot, who's out to kill the wolves on behalf of Tony Brummett and the big game industry in British Columbia. And our intrepid Pamela Martin, who's been up there suffering in 40 below cold, is first of all going to give us a little cameo of what happened over the weekend, and then we'll talk to Pamela about the wolf hunt.
At 4:45 Friday afternoon, the wolf protesters headed straight into the heavy forest. 100 feet in, one of them was ready to give up.
Why don't we just count 5 years from now? Okay.
Back at Coal River 16 hours later, there was evidence that all had not gone well in the cold Kachika Valley. 3 protesters had turned back after a minus 40-degree nightmare.
Oh, that guy was having problems. He didn't have the proper clothing on, and our sleeping bags weren't adequate. So, well, we couldn't let him go out on his own. He wouldn't have made it.
What happened, Peter?
Well, it's the thing, I went back without my snowshoes, and I got a lot of snow in my boots, and I got frostbitten feet. That's all.
Was that last night that you got frostbitten?
No, it's just this morning when I came back. Until last night, everything went all right. But I thought it was too dangerous on my account. No, I'm not talking about the others.
Those who brought Van Dugteren out describe a sleepless night of tending the fire to keep him warm. He was in pain, emotionally distraught, crying uncontrollably, they said, and unwilling to walk out in the morning. They said they fired warning shots to shock him to his senses in order to save himself. For Tim Renshaw, the mission was clearly unsafe.
it's a group of people and no one's the leader. Everybody has their kind of job, and I felt days ago somebody should have took a firmer stand on this fellow wasn't well equipped, but that's why we stopped early and to see how he went through the night. But it spoiled my trip because I would have liked to got through. But
was it your decision to bring him out?
yeah, it was my decision. I was the one who decided, and I didn't even consult those guys. I knew he had to go back. He was going to stop what we wanted to do.
On the phone from Fort Nelson is Pamela Martin. Pamela, when they went in off the Alaska Highway on Friday, how far did they actually get in off the highway? Pamela?
Jack, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Bring up the level a bit. I can hear you fine. How far did they actually camp in from the highway?
Well, it's hard for us to know exactly, Jack. We caught up with them on Sunday morning at about 9 o'clock, and at that point they had been out in the bush for 40 hours, and they were camped less than a mile from the highway.
Let me make it clear. You caught up with them in the BCTV helicopter.
That's right.
So they were less than a mile from the highway after 40 hours. What had they done? Had they gone along a trail parallel to the road?
Well, that's what they say they did. They say that they followed a trail along the highway in about a half a mile, and it was quickly evident they had to have snowshoes or they just couldn't make any headway. So they stopped in at an Indian settlement and borrowed some snowshoes.
That's quite pathetic. In other words, for all you know, they might have just gone in a mile off the highway and camped there because they couldn't go any further. They're in danger of dying, are they not?
Well, they certainly could be, Jack, if they went much further from the highway. The land here that they're intending to cross is desolate, it's freezing cold, and it's very, very dangerous to walk along the river because in many parts of it, the river is open. Sometimes you can see the water, and sometimes it's hidden beneath the snow, so it's just filled with traps. You just never know.
And they have the 122, which they used to rouse that sick fellow during the night to make him come to his senses. Is that right?
That's right, Jack, and they no longer have that 22. That was brought back with the 3 who returned. So now they have no arms, they have no radio, they didn't end up taking the snowmobile, and they do have snowshoes. That's about the only thing. Where
are they? Are they headed for that ranch where Elliot's camp is? And Elliot, of course, being the biologist who's now in the 4th or 5th day of his wolf kill?
Yes, that's their plan. That's where they're headed, and we hear different numbers on exactly how far it is. Some people say it's 120 miles if they follow the river. Perhaps they could take some shortcuts, but at the very least it's 75 miles.
Don't you think it's about time? Is Watson giving any thought to giving up and coming out again and doing his battle of propaganda instead of risking his and other people's lives?
Well, it would seem that they would certainly like to find that option. They have a fellow who came up from California, apparently, who is a commercial pilot. He's been here for 2 days, trying desperately to find any kind of an aircraft. I think he needs a helicopter to get in there, and what he'd like to do is pick them up from wherever they are and drop them off at Scoop Lake, which is where Dr. John Elliott is.
Well,
so far, he hasn't been able to get an aircraft, and he does have a pilot this morning. I just spoke to him a few minutes ago, who said he may fly him, but he wants a certified check. And, of course, he doesn't have one here. So now they're trying to find some of the finances and scramble around, hopefully go out and pick them up and drop them off right at the location.
All right, now, have you any idea how Elliot's wolf kill is going? Because he was scheduled to be finished in another 4 days, wasn't he?
That's right, Jack. Last I talked to him, he's got 56, 58 wolves at this point. The hunt will be over on the 17th. That's Friday. He wants to get between 90 and 100 wolves. So chances are he could get that and pull out before Project Wolf ever gets there.
In other words, you, in the BCTV helicopter and whatnot, are really will be acting as search and rescue for Watson if he spends another night in the bush and then somebody else flips the lid.
Well, I don't know about that, Jack. Actually, there are a number of people in the area who are monitoring them quite closely. The man who owns the ranch where John Elliott is working, he has quite a few airplanes, and they've been keeping track of where Project Wolf is all along. As well, the emergency officer here, the man in charge of the emergency program, he called me to find out where they were because he, too, wants to keep track of them. So it seems like everybody else can get a helicopter except them.
Yeah, well, of course, they should have had one before they went up, said Webster, to be brutally practical. They should have had all that lined up, because you were telling me the climate this morning is what?
Well, it's very, very cold. I haven't stepped foot outside yet.
How long can you stay outside when you were up at their camp? How long could you stay outside?
Well, I'm pretty well dressed. I can sit outside maybe 5 minutes at the most before I'm absolutely freezing, so I don't know.
Could you walk 120 miles in that climate?
Jack, I couldn't walk half a mile.
You'd be dead before you got a couple of miles, wouldn't you?
Well, I would certainly feel like it. Your feet freeze up quickly, your hands.
Do you think Watson's making a farce of the whole thing, or is he just in over his head?
Well, perhaps he is in over his head. At this point, it looks as though it's impossible for them to do what they plan to do. And if they can't get an aircraft, there's no way they can get to the ranch within 4 or 5 days.
So are you going out to find them again today, Pamela?
We're not sure yet, Jack. We probably will. We're just trying to monitor it from this end right now. We're in Fort Nelson, and of course it's a few hundred miles up the highway. There's a few people up there that we can contact, part of Project Wolf, who are there on the highway. They're keeping track of it as much as they can, but of course we don't know where they are right now because they have no radio contact.
No radio contact, no snowmobile, only one pair of snowshoes, dried food, and pathetic fires.
Well, the other plan is, apparently there are 2 snowmobiles, one-man snowmobiles, owned by the Indian family that lives in Coal River, which is where they headed out from. And they're heading out there this morning to apparently go in front of the Project Wolf people and try to break track for them. That's the latest plan.
Good for them. Okay, Pamela, we'll have your full report on the noon, and you'll be doing a big one for 6 o'clock tonight. Anyway, we hope nobody gets really done in by this trip. It seems a bit stupid now, doesn't it?
Well, it does seem pretty pointless because even if they get there, the hunt will be over.
Pamela Martin, BC TV News. Keep at it and don't stay out in that 40 below more than 5 minutes.
Okay, Jack, thanks a lot.
Best of luck.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Okay, next Kaufman after the break. You're a civil servant.
Yes, sir.
Kind of mouthy civil servant.
At times, yes.
What is your precise job, Hugh Kaufman, U.S. Environmental Protection Association?
Well, I was one of the people who started the United States EPA and their program in hazardous waste.
Oh, you're a good friend of James Watt's, are you?
As a matter of fact, I'm debating James Watt Tuesday in North Dakota.
Dare we say what he said, which enabled him to be fired by Reagan?
Well, that's not really why he was fired, but you can say it if you like.
No, he made a gross remark about he was a very moderate, understanding, non-discriminatory person because he'd had a Jewish person, a black person.
No, a woman, a black, 2 Jews, and a cripple on a commission.
In here, Jim, eh? He belongs in the Social Credit Cabinet in Victoria, but that's beside the point. Why was he fired?
He was basically fired because Reagan was coming up to the election, and the policies of the administration for environmental health protection have been so bad, and Watt had been so outspoken, they had to get him out of the way to lower the noise from the administration before the election. In other words, the president's
Now, your
ungood
department
behavior.
has been involved in a number of scandals, has it not?
I'd say that's an understatement.
An understatement, including one in which you blew the whistle about the misuse of superfund money put up by the big companies to clean up the environment. Is that correct?
Well, that's certainly one part of the scandal that I testified against. Basically, as a result of my testimony to Congress, 6 congressional committees started investigating the administration, and the President of the United States was forced to cough up all the top people at EPA.
Cough up, you mean fire?
Fire.
Burford.
Burford.
What was she accused of doing?
Well, Burford was involved in, of course, contempt of Congress, as well as involved in decisions to help favored companies escape liability for pollution problems they created.
Was she convicted of something?
She was never brought to trial. The only person brought to trial was Rita Lavelle, the assistant administrator who worked for Reagan when he was governor of California. They had to have a scapegoat, and so Rita was the scapegoat. She was the only one who went to grand jury and trial. She's going to be going to jail for 6 months and 5 years community service. The Attorney General of the United States chose not to bring anyone else up on charges, despite the fact that the FBI had the evidence of criminal activity that was much broader than just Rita Lavelle.
How the devil do you survive? You testify against your boss's at congressional hearings, and you'd be out in your ears so quick you wouldn't know what hit you. Here.
Yeah, well, the United States has more checks and balances in their government, and because I have a broad constituency in the Congress as well as within the American people.
By broad constituency, you mean friends and supporters?
Friends and supporters in both parties, both Republican and Democrat. And because I do have enough of a constituency within the populace of the country as well as in the national news media, they can't just willy-nilly throw me out. They have to have a reason.
Now, let's talk about some more of your problems. Love Canal, now that was a real scandal, wasn't it?
Well,
where you built
yeah.
the housing scheme on top of radioactive waste.
Well, it wasn't radioactive, it was chemical waste. It was waste from the Hooker Chemical Company, which is a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum. Love Canal was not the worst case in the United States.
What was the worst?
Well, in that part of the United States, it was the S area dump, which had the same chemicals that were in Love Canal, but they were leaking directly into the drinking water supply of the whole county, whereas Love Canal was just a small area.
And have you cleaned these up?
No. We have identified over 17,000 of these toxic waste sites in the country to clean up. The Superfund program is put in place to start cleaning them up, but as a result of Burford and all the other people not doing anything other than helping their political friends with the money, we've only cleaned up 6.
Acid rain. Now, you dump this acid rain and wreck thousands of our... I know we're not guilt-free, but you wreck all these lakes, and I presume that nothing efficient will be done about that for the next 50 years.
Well, our new boss, Bill Ruckelshaus, the head of EPA, proposed to the president a program to start to solve the acid rain problem, but the president overruled him, and at the present time he is not allowed to start implementing a program to solve the acid rain problem, only to continue to study it.
Can it be solved?
Certainly. You can certainly reduce the amount of sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides going into the air by scrubbing stacks, by changing the type of coal you use in areas like the Ohio Valley.
Boy, I envy your government. It's so much more open with people like you than ours.
Absolutely.
How far ahead are you of us in handling toxic waste, radiation, and all these disgusting chemical dumps?
Well, based on what I've seen, you're probably about 15 years behind us. In other words, you're going down the road now that we were going down in the 60s, which ended up creating the catastrophes like Love Canal. You're just doing what we did and not learning from our mistakes.
Well, I have a huge ad from Genstar IT Corporation in front of me, which relates to the proposed landfill toxic waste sites between Kamloops and the Merritt Valley, right? Mm-hmm. And I get the impression that we should trust industry, that we'll break down PCBs and that these landfills for toxic waste will be safe. True or false?
False. That's why the United States is banning landfills. The state of California is banning landfills, Illinois, Florida, New York. In fact, the House of Representatives has voted to ban landfills because of these catastrophes.
But what the devil can you do with this stuff if you don't dig it into the ground?
Well, as a matter of fact, our technical studies as old as 10 years ago, show that there's no reason to dump any toxic waste into the ground. All those materials can be recycled, destroyed, detoxified, or not generated in the first place with plant changes. And in fact, many industries who are enlightened in the United States are doing that. 3M in Minneapolis, as a matter of fact, has had a process for changing production processes and destroying those materials.
It's a good, you must be a conservative because you're an American, right?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty conservative economically, yes, sir.
Yeah, that's right. You'd vote for Reagan tomorrow, probably. But
well, I can't talk about that because it's illegal under the Hatch Act.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the fact is that to cure these PCBs and toxic wastes and radiation waste costs money and reduces the profit margin.
Well, in reality, it saves money. Let's take a look at a case like Love Canal. If the Hooker Chemical Company would have destroyed those materials, it would have cost them $1 million. The taxpayers of the United States and New York State have had to pay over $100 million to try and ameliorate that situation. So in terms of economics, it makes much more sense to have the generators of the waste destroy or detoxify or recycle their materials at the plant site because you're saving 100 times as much in tax dollars.
That's in the startup. You must, the moment you're handling this stuff, you've got to get rid of it Into the atmosphere, I presume.
No, you destroy it. Present technology.
You break it down.
Yes, you break it down into its non-toxic constituents.
Into water that you can drink. That kind of caper.
Well, I don't know about that, but let's take a high-temperature incinerator which could handle the organic fraction of the waste materials generated in British Columbia. Okay, the preponderance of your materials are organic. The state of the art today will allow for destruction of 99.9999999% of all those materials with no escape into the atmosphere.
You can turn it into ivory soap, 99.999% pure.
100, yes.
More with Kaufman about the Ashcroft caper after the break. You won't tell me who you'll vote for because of the Hat Shack.
Right.
This is Hugh Kaufman from Washington, D.C.
Yes, sir.
Dreadful place, huh?
Oh, it's a pretty nice town.
But you can't tell me who you would vote for because of the Hat Shack.
That's correct.
In other words, civil servants have got to keep their mouths shut on politics.
On politics.
But you can kick hell out of your boss and not be fired. Why are you not fired? Is it a special act to protect you?
Yes, as a matter of fact, in the Superfund law, there's employee protection provisions. I helped write that act. And exercising that, I operate under a consent agreement now because the administration put me under domestic surveillance and monitor my phones. And I'm protected by the U.S. Court of Appeals.
Just a minute. You're telling me that the administration, the FBI...
No, the Reagan administration.
Put you under...
Domestic surveillance.
Monitored your phones.
That's correct.
You found out about it.
That's correct.
And everything hit the fan.
Absolutely.
Did they get anything on you?
Well, they found that I sleep with my wife. They've got some good pictures of that.
And if they hadn't found pictures?
Yeah.
Didn't know it was your wife?
I guess not. They found out when they read about it in the New York Times, though.
If you fed it to the New York Times, of course.
Of course.
You blew it to the New York Times.
Of course.
Geez, that's great. You get much money? You're a big shot.
What? Well, I'm not selling those pictures, but I haven't been offered enough money.
That's great.
But
okay.
the administration may sell it to defer campaign funds.
There's a fellow out there called Brummett, Big Tony Brummett. Huge hands, very nice guy. Won't talk to me about wolves. You talk to him about Ashcroft, because on the face of it, just as another kind of redneck, I think if they want to dump some waste up at Ashcroft in a valley that nobody sees, who cares?
Well, that's the whole point, I think. They want to open up a toxic waste dump where no one can see. And because there are strict regulations in the United States and strict enforcement, a lot of the United States toxic waste will be making its way up to Ashcroft.
Oh, come off it. We're not going to let you bring your toxic waste across the border.
The way the laws are structured, federal, both in Canada and the United States, your borders are open and will continue to be open. And
do we send waste down to you?
Yes, you do.
So once we open Ashcroft, all the guck. Take a break. We've got an audio problem. What?
With a capital F.
Have a mic.
Now is the goddamn time. This fucks me up the rest of the program.
Okay, it's all right. I mean, you know, we just go on.
Was it audible?
Yes, it was audible, but it was very annoying. The levels were up and down, and so it's best to stop. Are you okay now, Bert? Talk, Jack.
Now. Now is the time for all good men to come into the goddamn country.
Buy low, sell high. That.
Now is the time for all good men. It's booming now.
Boom, boom.
I hear the boom, boom now. Yeah, I can hear a boom. There's a feedback from over there. Wonder that speaker's over.
What, did Jen start cut the juice?
Hey?
30 seconds coming back.
Put up the phones.
Listen up, Jack.
My name is Mr. Breau. Breau.
Herb Breau.
Is he bright? That's the important thing.
If you're talking
He
to
doesn't
anybody
look...
outside, talk straight to camera.
Okay.
Handicap for us. Hugh Kaufman of the EPA was just telling us that the Reagan administration bugged his phone, took pictures of he and his wife in bed.
In a motel room.
Oh, they thought you were some dolly. And you
Well,
fooled
my wife is very good looking.
I know, but you fooled them by giving the story to New York Times.
Well, and Newsweek and the Washington Post and UPI and AP.
Oh, you're great. I must admit, you won't last too long, bro. They'll find a way to get you. Ashcroft, I was saying that, you know, the average person doesn't give a continental. If they take some valley in the mountain somewhere and say we're going to put 1 million tons of toxic waste in it. First, what is toxic waste?
Basically, it's the industrial byproducts that at small quantities can wipe out water supplies, the food people eat, the air they breathe. The United States generates 240 million metric tons of materials that have been getting into people's drinking water supplies, and a lot of people in the United States have had their water supplies wiped out.
And you've got 15,000 such waste-fill sites in the States.
17,000.
17,000.
Yes.
And you're still using them.
So we're using about 7,000 sites, but they're closing quickly, and we have not had any new ones in 3 years.
Tony Brummett, tell him where he's wrong.
Tony Brummett, I don't know where he's right or where he's wrong, but if you are going to control toxic waste, you have to have laws and regulations and strong enforcement to protect the public, much as is done in the United States. Otherwise, the waste will move to the least common denominator up here. Number two, you've got to have strict liability. The United States now has, under the Superfund law, the ability to clean up emergencies, spills, or toxic contamination, and then send a bill to the generators of waste for up to 3 times the cost. Up to 3 times the cost, which gives negative incentive for companies to dump, but rather gives positive incentive for them to destroy, recycle, and detoxify their own waste.
Is this economic, though? I mean,
it's very economic. It's good economics.
Because of your poor economy, we're suffering here. We're the tail of the Yankee dog, as you know, in many ways. And we've got 20,000 out of work, pulps closed down, bad recession, government cutting back, lays off 400 foresters, closed motor vehicle testing, wiping out programs for the underprivileged. We can't afford to do things like you're suggesting for toxic waste.
Well, I think you're wrong. I think you can afford not to. Again, let me give you the Love Canal example. If Hooker Chemical would have destroyed those wastes, it would have cost them $1 million. It's cost the taxpayers over $100 million to deal with that situation.
Apart from the damage to the people in Love Canal.
Not even talking about the health impact to the citizens. You can't afford not to.
This is proven. In other words, if we go ahead with the toxic waste in Ashcroft, we're stupid.
Well, you're just making the same mistakes that the United States made and which we're trying to get out of.
But isn't it good for a couple of generations before it gets into the water supply? I'm looking for an excuse for Brummett.
Well, first of all, in looking at the geology up there, it's clear to me...
You've been up?
Yes, sir. Looking at the geology, it's clear to me that the impact could be quite quick, within a few years.
Into the Fraser River?
Ultimately, we'll get to the Fraser River. Geologists will say, well, it'll take 5 years, some will say 30 years, but it'll get to the Fraser River.
I gather you're not just a bleeding heart.
Well, I'm pretty conservative economically.
Yeah, and this can be professionally proven that toxic waste will eventually get into the water system.
It's been proven all over the world. As a matter of fact, no one has proven that it can't. We haven't found a toxic dump that hasn't leaked yet.
I don't know. I'd like to support you all the way, but I know damn fine people won't.
Well, I don't know. One of the things that happened in Ashcroft, and basically I was brought in by the Lillooet Tribal Council and by BC PIRG to exchange information. One of the things that came out is that the citizens wanted to have Mr. Brummett and myself and a representative from Genstar IT go to Ashcroft and Vancouver and participate in an information forum.
Did Brummett come?
No, he did not come. He was invited, and they're going to try and get him to come with me.
Did Genstar come?
No, they had a public relations person there.
They don't matter, do they?
Well, they matter, but they don't know anything about the technical issues.
And you do?
Well, I'm one of the leading experts in the United States.
All right, let's just go back to one thing that you really muffed, you people.
What did we muff?
EDB. Here,
Yes.
now we're told that we've been eating food, what you do, we do, which has got carcinogens in it for God knows how many years. You're banning them, but you're giving them a honeymoon period of 5 or 10 years or
3 to 5 year honeymoon period. That's
What is
correct.
EDB?
Ethylene dibromide is a organic chemical compound that is basically used on citrus fruits and grain products. I could spend all day telling you about that. It's of the family of chemicals that causes mutations, birth defects, etc. I did a case in Lathrop, California, of workers who were working with EDB and its sister chemical DBCP, and the preponderance of those healthy young men were sterile as a result of it. So it does have very severe impacts.
How long have we been consuming EDB in food?
Well, you've probably been consuming small traces for 20 or so years, but the levels have been steadily going up. So the levels that that are being consumed now are higher than they used to be.
Mind you, we're all still a hell of a lot healthier than we were 25 years ago, and we live a lot longer.
That's correct, because medical research and nutrition have gotten better. There's no question about that. In other words, medicine is much better. So that's pushing us up to live longer and healthier, but toxic chemicals are pushing it back down again.
Here's a call from Ashcroft. I hope it's one of your enemies, not a friend.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have two questions. Good morning, Hugh. Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Two questions for you. One is, the Genstar have been telling us that they're going to have, these wastes are all going to be solid, a solid type. Has this type of solidification process been proposed and used in the world, and what is the track record on that? Second, if we have landfills, will it stop illicit dumping?
Okay, those are good questions. First of all, the technique that they're proposing is being used and has been used in England. In fact, the executive vice president of IT involved in this proposal was the person who brought that technique to England. As a result of the England facility having problems and not meeting the specifications of not leaking and breaking down, which it was doing, he left England and is now with IT and will be involved in this proposal. So, in fact, that technique has been used and it doesn't work.
Okay, boy, so you're against the landfill?
Well, he had a second question, illicit disposal. The executive vice president of IT has stated in the United States that having a toxic waste landfill will not have any impact on illicit disposal. That's a police type function. If the police are looking for illegal disposers, they'll find them. If they're not, they won't.
Yeah. Well, we can't. There's more than Brummett to blame. The federal government must be to blame in
There's
Canada,
no
too.
question you need federal standards. Otherwise, the waste will move from one place to the other. You have to have federal standards to protect the public.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
How many years does it take for this stuff to break down? Does it ever break down to its natural state again, or does it take 10,000 years?
No, these materials do not break down naturally. It's not like a newspaper that's in a trash dump. It's not like domestic sewage. These materials stay toxic for a long time.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, one thing I'd like Mr. Kaufman to address is the latency period to the exposure of these chemicals. The fact that after you're exposed, it may take quite a long period of time before any noticeable thing happens to the individuals. And the other thing I'd like is to know how we can get a copy of the Superfund Act.
Well, basically, your federal government has copies of the Superfund law, and it's being reauthorized right now, as is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, so it'll even be strengthened in this Congress. But you can get that from Environment Canada. They have copies of it. With regards to latency period, what we're talking about is very small quantities of very toxic materials, and basically you would expect to see the health effects impacting adults 20, 30 years down the line. Now, with regards to pregnant women, that's a different situation. Obviously, the Love Canal and other cases like that have had high cancer rates, high problems within a few years with the next generation that's born. We had 13 deaths around a landfill in Woburn, Massachusetts of young children because of this.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. I'm wondering if your guest could explain more clearly the breakdown process. I think people are having a hard time imaging what he means by what's being done, and they're suspicious that what's ever being used to destroy these chemicals is going to be in the same way mysterious. And secondly, I'd like his comments on that barge coming down our coast. It gives me great concern. I know those waters, and I'm wondering why that barge is as tall as it is and the load is as large as it is.
What's in the barge again?
Some sort of hazardous goods. I can't keep track.
PCBs from Alaska.
In the barge.
What is that, Bonneville Powers PCBs?
Yeah, from Power Things,
right.
I suppose.
Okay. First of all, Letty mentioned breakdown process. I guess she's interested in the high temperature incinerators. These incinerators hit very high temperature, over 2,000 degrees with, in some cases, 4 and 5 second dwell times at that temperature. And basically, it breaks down the compounds to their elements. That's what happens.
Once they're in their elements, they're all right.
Once they're in their elements, they can be controlled.
What about this PCB barge?
Well, the PCB barge, obviously, whenever you have large quantities of toxic materials like that moving on the water, you have a chance for spills or accidents. There's no question about that. Dealing with PCBs is much harder than dealing with oil. Obviously, we transport oil on barges and boats, but it's easier to clean them up. Hopefully, if the barge meets good standards and is operated properly, you will not have an accident.
Well, it's safer on the inside passage than on the outside, I should imagine.
I agree with that, Jack.
Actually, it is, depending on the road systems. It's much easier to transport on land because if you have an accident, it's easier to clean it up on land when you've got mixed hazardous waste than on the water.
Take a final call from Ashcroft. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Kaufman. It's the lady with her arms folded from Ashcroft.
Oh, yes. How are you? We had about 200 people.
I know you haven't got very much.
Be careful. This guy's often under surveillance. But carry on.
Know that. But his wife's beautiful. Listen, Jack, I wanted you to know that the mayor wasn't at that meeting.
I thought he was kind of on the fence in favor of it.
Well, no, he wasn't at the meeting, and our local newspaper representative was not at the meeting. Nobody of any consequence, except us, of course, and Mr. Kaufman, we're at the meeting. I want you to know that it's the government that approached Genstar and gave them a mandate to get a toxic waste put into BC, and that's all I have to say.
Could I just make a point? 11 o'clock today here in Vancouver, BC PIRG is sponsoring a forum, which I'm going to participate in, on this whole problem. It'll be at 2150 Maple Street. 2150 Maple Street at 11 o'clock, sponsored by BC PIRG.
What's at 2150 Maple?
I guess it's an office.
At 11 o'clock?
11 o'clock today, sir.
Boy, oh boy, did you come up for free? You didn't pay you?
No, they're paying my expenses.
Paying your expenses.
The Lillooet Tribal Council and BC PIRG are paying my expenses.
Huey, you're a delight.
Well, thank you.
I don't often say that to Americans. I'm generally suspicious of them. We come back sometime.
I'd love to. I'd love to debate Jim Watt up here instead of in the United States.
And the medical profession. We could talk about the medical
Oh,
profession.
I could get going on that.
Yeah, and we could talk about politicians, couldn't we?
Well, you got more of them coming.
My thanks to Hugh Kaufman.
Thank you.
Fisheries, schmisheries. I have fairly blunt views about this fishing mess in British Columbia, but I'm not allowed to say them. So we'll have John Fraser, the Tory De Bane tomorrow, and Fraser today. Let's see if they can ever clear up this disastrous salmon fishing industry on the West Coast. John Fraser after the break.
Ourselves if we think that we can avoid sacrifices in order to maintain that resource, because I don't think that anybody wants to catch the last fish.
The politicians and the industry have managed to confuse the picture so badly about the salmon crisis and the fishing crisis on the West Coast that I'm sure we ordinary people wonder what the hell's going on. I know this much, though, that Pierre De Bane, the Fisheries Minister, doesn't particularly like John Fraser, at least his policies. He's accused Fraser of having bankrupt policies, being guilty of crass political opportunism, using cheap rhetoric, spurious plans, little if any concern, the whole charade, crass shams. That's what De Bane thinks of Fraser, the fisheries critic. What do you think of De Bane, the Liberal Minister?
Well, I think that he's mistaken.
Come on, John, let your hair down and go at him.
Well, when the minister hasn't got much to say, he had to write out a number of comments that would get some news. The only thing is that I think we probably advanced the cause by telling people exactly what he did say. He was pretty upset on Friday the 3rd because we dared to move a motion in the House condemning the government for its mismanagement of the West Coast fishery. And then he said, you know, the terrible thing to pick Friday because nobody's around and no one will pay any attention to it. And he forgot to tell us, of course, what everybody knows is that the government picks the opposition days. So it was his day. We just decided to talk about fisheries.
A lot of ordinary people have lost a lot of sympathy with a lot of fishermen, because through years we've seen them in the good years going out and buying big new boats, all the rest of it, and then a couple of seasons later they're out looking for handouts from the government. Then we went through the Pierce report. And the Pierce report very simply said, too many fish, too many boats chasing too few fish. We suggest that they be cut back and that royalties be placed on landing and that a fund be built up to get a large proportion of the fishing boats out of the fleet. That was the Pierce report, basically, wasn't it?
It was a good part of it, but not all of it. But, you know, it's not good enough to come back after years and years of mismanagement and blame the fishermen. The old buyback plan, the Davis plan, which I don't blame Jack Davis for what happened, but it started in '69, and 10 years later we had more boats and more catching capacity, and that was a direct result of policy decisions or lack of them by the department. Mr. De Bane said in the House that the problem was the fault of the overcapitalization and greed of the Western fishermen. They used exactly the same arguments in Atlantic Canada for a number of years. But the Cruikshank report, which was commissioned by this government to look into the problems of the fleet, overcapitalization, too much catching capacity, said this, and I know you don't like me reading things on the air, but this is what the Cruikshank report said. This was a government-commissioned report. The present fleet capacity and overcapitalization is the direct result of government inefficiency and a series of misjudgments and inactions. Now, why should I, as a British Columbian, put up with somebody coming out here and saying the fault's all the fishermen? And maybe you were getting close to saying that, Jack.
No, I'm not. But I'll tell you right now that there's a bank debt against the fishing fleet of $132 million. And if there is a buyback, guess who will get the licenses as collateral? The banks will get the licenses, and the banks will keep the licenses and sell them again. And there'll be no reduction of the fishing fleet, even if they did seize all these boats.
No, if a buyback is properly administered on the basis of application, if the applications are vetted by an industry management board that we propose, then at least to a significant degree that won't happen. The boats and the licenses will come out.
All right. You're obviously going to be the next government of the country if and when His Eminence Pierre Trudeau decides to go. If and when. Spring next year? Spring next year?
I haven't got any better idea than you have, Jack, because the Prime Minister, I don't think, has made up his mind. And I'm not assuming anything. I hope that we are the government.
But please spell for me in simple fashion what the Tory plan is to rescue the fishing industry on the West Coast.
Well,
1, 2, 3, 4.
Let's start off with the salmon and the life cycle of the salmon. The salmon can't live unless they've got habitat.
Right.
So the first bottom line is habitat restoration and enhancement, and going into the streams where the races have become extinct or so low that they can't function, and restoring them.
How long will that take and how much money?
It will take quite a lot of money, and it will take some years. But if you don't start there, all of the other stuff is just pitching and putting.
How much would you put into a salmonid enhancement program?
Well, we're waiting for the second stage of SEP, as it's called, Salmonid Enhancement Program, which includes the steelhead and the trout. The Fishermen's Coalition has said $200 million over 5 years, and they've asked me to agree with them. And I've said, no, I'm not going to either agree or disagree because I don't know whether that's enough money. You see, what Pierce pointed out was that 1/2 of all salmon production in British Columbia comes from the hundreds of small streams that there's no data on and they cannot be analyzed for management purposes. So what we're saying is, for goodness sakes, let's get at it. Let's clean up the habitat. Let us go to a policy, it's never been said before, we're saying it, of net gain of habitat generally in British Columbia.
Will De Bane not tell me the same thing tomorrow?
I wish he would. I hope you ask him, and I hope you tell him that if he wants to maintain his credibility, he should at least say as much as we're saying.
Is he discriminating against us by pouring hundreds of millions into the East Coast?
I think that's a bum rap. And I'll
What
tell you
happened
why.
to Bane?
I'll tell you why.
Oh.
I'll tell you why.
That's
Because I
unnormal.
was the first federal politician to suggest, in fact, to state in the first week in December 1982 that the East Coast fishery needed an infusion of at least $100 million of public money immediately by way of grants, guarantees, or whatever in order to stabilize it. I have never taken the position that the money spent in Atlantic Canada need not have been spent. But what I can say this is that it is being spent there, and it isn't being spent here.
Okay. The rest of the Tory plan to salvage the fisheries industry after the break. Well, if they've got no money for salmonid enhancement, the Liberals have lots of money for other things, don't they?
Well, yes. But you see, the reason that there isn't...
I'm talking about the ad campaign.
The $7 million.
To
That
eat
we'll
more
eat
fish. Isn't that just appalling arrogance?
Well, the problem with that is that, first of all, basically, the fish processing industry in Canada is private enterprise, and there's no justification for the government spending $7 million to convince you to eat fish. But what is worse is that we've got the Camano completion project coming. And we've got anticipated public hearings in front of the Utilities Commission of the province of British Columbia. And people keep saying that there will be no provincial money to fund interveners. And Alcan has said that they won't put any money up to fund interveners. And what we're saying is that if you can find $7 million to advertise to eat fish, the federal government can find the money to be sure that we've got interveners at that public hearing to defend the public interest on that Camano completion project.
They've got $7 million to help free enterprise packers sell their fish in Britain in Tasco stores.
Well, in Britain, our canned salmon is being boycotted because of the Atlantic seal hunt. And this is not funny.
Yeah, well, they may start boycotting it because of this crazy wolf protest too, but that's beside the point. The balance of the Tory plan, please. Salmonid enhancement, maybe 200 million, you don't know.
All right, that is fundamental.
That's point
now,
one.
A fisheries management board appointed by the various user groups in the industry, including the native fishermen, the commercial fishermen, the sports fishermen, and the processors.
This is a new board.
This is a board that's never been in existence at all. It's a new idea. And that board will actually make policy and recommend it directly to the minister. It will be published. The rationale for the policy will be published. And then we get accountability for the first time in the West Coast fishery.
Would they say how much fishing there would be?
Yes.
Because we might be down to 30,000 tons next year, and we might only be fishing every half day, a half day once a fortnight.
All right, I don't want to get into too much detail. Obviously, any policy decision has to be subject
to the minister.
Well, yes, it has to be subject to the minister. But in basic strategic positions, for instance, on buyback, for salmon enhancement, for rehabilitation, for all of these things, and the fleet restructuring, who is best able to decide what should be done? It's the fishermen. Now, they've got to report. They've got to.
It's the fishermen?
Yes, it is. And this is what's never been tried, and it's why the morale is so bad, and it's also why for 15 years we've gone the wrong direction. The other thing that it's very healthy for the fishermen to have to come up with some answers. You know, individually, they know it's true. They've all got the answers, but they're going to have to come together on it.
We've got to keep this intelligible to the public. Okay, how many fishing boats in the fleet? Trawlers, gill netters, combinations, seiners, etc. How many?
7,000. More than that, but that's about it.
And it's got to come down to what?
I don't know exactly.
4,000, I think, is the Pierce
Well,
figure.
there are different figures, but you've got to remember that for 14 months, the minister has been hiding behind the process of so-called consultation with the Minister's Advisory Council. And we know that recommendations have been made by MAC to the minister, but we don't see any results. And now, on January the 5th, we find a leaked cabinet or a leaked document, departmental document, which sets out 4 alternate strategies that the MAC is supposed to consider. Not one of them talks about habitat. The word isn't mentioned. Salmon enhancement program is not mentioned in it at all. And then on January 30th, we get another document, which is supposed to be an options document. And all it is a list of all the questions they should have been asking themselves 14 months ago when the process started.
All right, what's your plan to reduce the fleet?
We would accept a recommendation of the Fisheries Management Board. The plan that we think would work the best is on the basis of application to a board of industry people, that those applications would be considered, that the ones most deserving and most sensible would be taken out, keeping in mind that you're trying to get down excess catching capacity, that the funds available would be divided between the various gear types so that you're not just slamming one group as opposed to another, and that in order to get it going, the federal government should put upfront money immediately to get on with it, paid back by a royalty or other process over a period of time as the industry recovers and as the fishermen can pay for it. And what's bogging this all down now is that the minister keeps saying, well, you can't expect me to put public money into this. Why, I wouldn't do that in Atlantic Canada, and I couldn't do it here. And my answer is, we are asking you to put money up to get the plan going. As the fishermen can afford to pay for it, they will, because they will be the ones that get the benefit of the cut in the number of
Okay, you want a voluntary buyback of the inefficient or low producers in the industry who would be rescued by an industry-wide load guaranteed by royalties and get the banks off the hook.
Some of the banks will get off the hook to some degree, but if the applications are dealt with by fishermen, the absolutely ridiculous case probably won't be picked up. But you know, you can't get around the fact that if you have any kind of buyback, to some degree, some of the creditors are going to benefit.
Yeah, because they loaned the money on the basis that the license was part of the collateral for the money they gave them.
Yes, and if they loaned too much, even with the buyback, they wouldn't get any money.
Yeah, we know how stupid the banks were in the heights of so-called inflationary.
Well, Jack, after Dome, the banks have discovered fiscal conservatism again.
Yeah, I know. I hate to see them getting rescued on this too.
Well,
but
the issue is the fishery and the industry.
So basically, it's salmonid enhancement, cut the fleet, pay it back with royalties eventually when they... That's it, isn't it?
That's right. And the bottom line is habitat. In the long run, if you don't have habitat, you're not going to have
any fish.
And
Time for one segment of calls to John Fraser. One segment only to John Fraser after the break. Go ahead to John Fraser, the Tory fisheries critic.
Mr. Fraser, I'm pleased to see that you're doing something...
Put up the levels.
Mr. Fraser, I'm pleased to see that
Can't hear it. Just a minute. Try the level again.
Mr. Fraser.
That's a little better. Thank you. Let's go.
I'm pleased to see that you're doing something about it. Or
Hold on. I can't take that call. Let's try this one. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
That's better.
Yes, I'd like to know what the Tory policy would be on the high seas operation. Mr. De Bane had a meeting with the Japanese, and they've allowed them to proceed 10 degrees further west. What would be your plan?
Well, I think that happened a while ago. Secondly, if you ask fisheries people about it, they will tell you that they've got no recent data. The last is about 10 years or more ago. The allegations are everywhere. I don't know whether they're true or not. Our position is that we immediately start a tagging project and negotiate with the Japanese, put our people on their boats, and find out what's happening.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. This is a question about the sports fishery, Mr. Fraser.
Right.
What is your policy on the sports fishery? And another question is, with your council that you were talking about, the present one said a 20% reduction, maybe 10 this year and 10 the next year, when we all know that this is not good enough. And you have the Japanese starting to export, you have Norway with their pen rearing, cutting into the European market. How economic will that?
Okay, do you want to get into that?
There's a lot of questions there. Let's try to. First of all, the sports fishery. I've been a sports fisherman all my life. The sports fishery is of immense importance to the economy of British Columbia, and they are part of the solution. Now, as far as I'm concerned, they go on the management board that we've been talking about. and that they're just as much part of the fishing industry as anybody else. Now, you talked about the, well, what was the other point he raised, Jack? There's the sports fishery, and then he came in on...
what was the other point? What was the other point?
The buyback. The
buyback.
Now, you say that the MAC has recommended a 21% reduction. What we don't know whether that was recommended because somebody said to them, that's all the money you'll have. I'm not absolutely certain that that reduction is adequate, and we would have to take a long, hard look at it. The sports fishermen generally feel that unless there is a significant reduction of catching capacity, then if you just go at it in bits and pieces, it won't do any good, and I'm very aware of those representations.
One point I forgot to ask you, John Fraser, was the De Bane statement in Port Alberni that they were going to use fish as an economic base for the improvement of the position of native Indians. And there was a kind of indication there that they might get bigger and better quotas to the detriment of the non-Indian fishermen. Is that an essential ingredient for recovery of the Indian fisheries?
I'm going to be very careful in what I say, Jack, because right now, the confusion that has been created by comments by the minister and by Mr. O'Reilly, his aide, who is not a departmental man, on the question of the native peoples is causing a lot of difficulty up and down the coast. The position I take is it is not my job to settle native claims. It is my job to do everything possible to get a Minister of Fisheries to bring back the fishery. Now, to what degree a revitalized fishery can be used to help our native Indian fellow Canadians depends on us getting the fishery back, and that is my position. In the first place? In the first place.
A lot of feathers have been ruffled by these statements, have they not?
Well, I don't know whether that's a pun.
Oh, that's the wrong thing to say. A lot of people are upset.
Yes, they are, and I'm just hoping everybody will use a lot of common sense and calm down.
No, it's not the wrong thing to say. A lot of feathers have been ruffled. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster, Mr. Fraser.
Morning.
Hello.
Yeah, I've been noticing on the TV commercials on fisheries.
Eat fish.
Eat fish, yeah, right, you bet. I was just wondering, since we're so behind in the fisheries, why is the government telling us to eat so much fish, and why are they spending so much money on this particular, this little show that they put on TV?
Well, they're telling you to eat fish because if we can't get up our sales and get the prices of them up, a lot of fishermen on both coasts are not going to make a living. That's why they're doing it. What I quarrel with is that basically the processors, the fish processors and the sales outlets are in private enterprise, and they should be putting up their own advertising campaigns. And what really boggles the mind is the suggestion that there's no money for interveners for massive projects like the Camano Completion Project, and yet they can put up $7 million to, as you say, tell you to eat fish. I'm all for eating fish, but I think the advertising should be carried by those that make the money out of it.
One last question on the Tory plan about licenses. How would you reduce the licenses?
On the buyback, the license goes out.
Finish.
Yes.
Gone. Never comes back.
Well, it could come back if someday we've got a fishery that's a lot bigger and brighter and we've got some hope for it, but in the meantime it goes out.
And the boats go out of circulation, do they? Because the last time a lot of them came back into circulation with different licenses. As you said, we finished up with more boats than before the buyback.
That's right. But just because you did it the wrong way the last time doesn't mean you have to do it the wrong way the next time.
My thanks to John Fraser. Next we're going to talk to a Liberal MP from the Maritimes who's here as a stand-in for Monique Bejan on her great public-spirited plans to put the doctors and provincial governments in their place on the Canada Health Act. After the break. Hello.
Yes.
Are you there?
Yes.
That's better. Put that one up a bit and let me hear it.
Mr. Fraser? Hello.
We're finished with Mr. Fraser, sir. Thanks for your call. See, hear that? That's because your levels are high somewhere. They're not adjusted properly.
Check.
I'll do this without phones. Thanks, John.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. I'd forgotten we'd met, Herb.
Well, we met one time, but not here.
Where, in Ottawa?
No.
Monique Bejan, the Minister of Health, sometimes appears like a saint in shining armor if saints appear in shining armor, because she's obviously mad at any provincial government that uses deterrent fees, charges premiums, extra bills and all the rest of it. And she's threatening that she'll deduct that amount of money from the federal grants of Medicare. Here is Herb Breau. How closely are you associated with Monique on this business? Are you a spokesman for her?
Well, to some extent, not officially, but I've been involved with her within the Liberal caucus. And I was chairman of a task force, a parliamentary task force in '81 on fiscal arrangements, where we suggested just about the same thing.
So you're a Liberal from Gloucester, New Brunswick?
That's right.
And we have a government in Victoria that wants to give out numbers to ration the numbers of doctors. And if they don't get a number, they won't be able to operate. And we charge premiums, and there are a lot of doctors who want to extra bill. Are we a very bad bunch of people on the West Coast?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say you're necessarily a bad bunch. It's just that some people ideologically would rather have a health system that would provide for more private sources of funding. And a lot of other people in the country think that that's not a good thing to do.
Spell out the threat from the Liberals in the Canada Health Act.
Well, it seems
or
to me...
Or the promise, whatever it is.
It seems to me that there are two sides to this issue. One is the social and human side, the extent to which you want to take risks in the future, right now and in the future, towards the accessibility to health care and the universality and comprehensiveness of health care. To what extent do you want to risk socially that people will be restricted in getting the best health care possible by their financial means?
Don't give me the philosophy. Give me your plan. What is it you want us not to do?
Oh, we want provincial governments to do away with user fees.
All user fees?
All user fees.
Even $2 or $4 for the emergency?
Yes, unless they are for chronic care where people really don't have to pay for room and board anymore.
Or where they take their pension checks, less a little.
That's right, that's right. And we want provinces to encourage doctors to stop extra billing. And if
to encourage or to ban it?
We want. Well, it's up to them. They can either do it through legislation. By banning, you mean legislation? They can either do it that way, or they can do it through a collective agreement of some kind with the province, with the doctors. As long as there are no extra billing, we're happy. And if they don't, we will estimate the amount of user charges and extra billing that goes on in the particular province, and we will deduct it from the federal payment.
That's fair.
Now we're not suggesting that. We're not suggesting that for premiums. We're suggesting that for user fees and extra billing. Well, the bill is not through the House yet. It's now.
What's the total cost of Medicare across the country?
The total cost of Medicare across the country is about $18 billion.
18 billion. How much do the feds actually pay?
About 50%.
Used to be 50. I believe it's less than 50 now.
No, it's still around 50.
18 billion, you pay 50.
Yes.
So therefore, if we collected, say, 5 million in user fees, you'd deduct that from our check, which we get from Ottawa, into the provincial government.
In British Columbia, it is estimated there's no extra billing practically no extra billing in British Columbia now. In 1984, we estimate there would be about $34 million in user charges, and we would deduct that from the payment.
You don't care about our premiums, do you?
Well, we do. We'd rather not have premiums because we think premiums...
Why shouldn't there be premiums? Why shouldn't people who can afford premiums not pay premiums?
Because somebody like you or me that makes a high income pays more tax. And we think that the raising of money to pay for health care should be based on the capacity to pay, not on the frequency of you being ill. Are you going to a hospital?
You would like to see premiums wiped out too and heavier taxes levied on those that can afford to pay for the whole thing.
Well, normally that's how the taxation system works. He who earns more pays more. Now, we're not suggesting we can do much about premiums because premiums are a lesser of two evils or a lesser of three evils. They're not as bad as user charges because at least it's a one-time payment or one payment a year, whatever the system is. User charges is a lot worse than extra billing because a sick person has to pay every time he or she goes.
How much of this can we afford to continue, even if you're all agreed, to fund the incredible demand for sophisticated health care across the country? Everybody wants a CAT scan, everybody wants a body scan, everybody wants every conceivable test there ever is. Is it not time we had some kind of deterrent on somebody? Because the doctors won't deter themselves. Because as you well know, the doctors are the wealthiest socialists in the country.
Yes.
Would you agree to that?
That
the doctors are in effect the wealthiest socialists in the country.
Well, I wouldn't want to get involved in that kind of thing.
Why not?
I'd rather leave that to you because I'm not so sure that all of them You see, the spokesman
Gosh,
for the
I
doctors...
had a chiropractor on the other day who
Yeah,
bills $500,000 a year for a one-man operation.
Yes, but
200,000
despite the spokesman from the medical profession, you find that only 2% in the country of doctors' incomes come from extra billing. There are very few doctors who extra bill.
What about
The
doctors'
spokesman-
incomes themselves? In British Columbia, they've gone from 300 million in 79 to 730 million in 83.
Yes, that's why I was explaining to you a while ago the two sides to this thing. One is the social and human side, which you call the philosophy. The other one is the practical advantages
Who's
of doing
gonna
away.
pay?
Well, the practical advantages of the approach of Monique Bégin, which I support, to do away with leakages in the system where more money can come in uncontrolled, fragmented sources of funding. The beauty of the Canadian system now, while there's a danger of abuse or misuse, as you indicated, the beauty of the system is that it is publicly controlled, sole source funding, where somebody on behalf of the public makes a decision about the amount of money that goes in the system. Doctors don't like that, and some provincial governments don't like that because they don't want that control. They'd rather have a fragmented sourcing of funds so that you and I wouldn't have anything to say about it.
So you don't care how much we raise as long as we raise it in non-fragmented fashion.
That's right, and that everybody pays based on his or her capacity to pay. That's a very, very well-known liberal
Who
principle.
controls the feather bedding or the overuse of the system?
In some cases, doctors. In some cases, hospital administrators. In some cases, provincial governments.
Don't you think it's an octopus that's going to choke us?
Well, there's a danger, but you see the beauty of our approach and of the health system or the funding of health system in Canada is that there is a continuous pressure to spend less. In the United States, for example, they're spending 2% more of their GNP on health because they don't have that kind of control.
And they've also got much higher charges in many ways.
Of course, because there's no
Blood,
control.
for instance.
If you're ill and you go see a doctor, you're not necessarily in very good shape to negotiate a fee.
No.
But if your provincial government negotiates a fee for you yearly, that can be a tougher bargaining session.
Yeah, it's more efficient, I suppose. But your position is quite clear. Any province, when does this Canada Health Act get passed?
We hope before April 1st.
Because Mulroney supports it, doesn't he?
He supports the principle. He has said now the Conservatives in the committee are trying to find all sorts of ways and attacking witnesses that agree with the bill. But I think that they've read the polls and they know that the Canadian people want this. And like most liberal policies, this is a good one, and they're going to support it.
What do the polls also show? The other polls.
The polls
that
show
we don't
that
want you.
No, the polls show that in the last 6 months, the trend is that the Conservatives are coming down and we're going up.
You got to be joking.
But it's a fact.
You're down a bit too, Barbie.
It's a fact. I mean, we're down, but we're coming up. We've been down before, you know. Don't forget.
You're gone this time.
No.
No, you can be elected dog catcher here.
We've been well. I'm not running here, but I wish I was.
Well. Yeah.
I wish I was. But we are going up. We've been down before, and
You're
we'll make it
suggesting
again.
you might win the next election.
We're going to win the next election.
Oh my God! After the break. I don't know. It worries me. We have an overproduction of doctors, and social credit apparently isn't going to cut them down. We're up to 130 medical graduates this year. We're apparently going to ration billing numbers. Does Monique and does Herb Breau approve of that? An overproduction of doctors for the most heavily doctored part of Canada?
One of the things we've got to do in this country is to tackle the issue of medical students enrollment.
We don't tackle it. Give me an answer. Should we cut back on them?
Yes, I think we should cut back on them, or we should cut back on, some economists, respected economists have suggested that we have 2 medical schools extra in this country, that we could do with 2 medical schools less than we are.
And we could use highly trained nurses for many procedures presently done by doctors.
Yes, our problem is that the distribution of physician resources is bad. We have a problem in the large cities. You have a lot of doctors and specialists, and in the outlying areas, you don't have as many. That's
Should we be able to move doctors to a place where they're needed? Direction of doctors.
I think we should have incentives to. I don't think we should
Let's
do it by
try the
coercion.
calls. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. So I've got a question about cost control. I would like to know why, when we go to the doctors, we don't have to sign a bill. There's no control on the doctor's billing.
Okay. Yes, well, some provinces, I'm told, do have some controls, and I think they should have. It seems to me that the taxpayer, when he's a user and somebody is paying for him, should know.
Well, let me tell you, in BC, we used to get it on a 3-monthly basis, but it was too expensive, and now they rely on the patterns of practice to catch doctors overdoing things.
Yeah, well, I'm told that in Quebec they have a pretty efficient auditing system where they check with the patients after the fact to make sure that the taxpayer agrees with what has been charged.
Isn't that where the stadium's falling down?
Is it falling down?
Big cracks in it.
Is that right? Well, it's still a beautiful stadium, and we have a nice baseball team.
Not as nice as ours.
Well, you don't have a baseball team yet.
We'll get one.
You're going to get one, and I'll support it.
And ours only cost $128 million. And it's a beauty. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. You speak of the social and human side of universality. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes.
All right. Now, this means that anybody can go to a doctor now or go into a hospital at no cost whatsoever.
More or less.
Well, just a second. You pay as a taxpayer.
All right. I realize that. However, they do that in England too, do they not?
I believe so.
All right. Now, how social and how human, that being the case, can universality be when in England, if you're over age 55, you are denied hemodialysis?
Ma'am, we're not talking about the budget system. You're totally off the topic. You're not making any sense. I cut you off. Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering if the Liberal government does come into power again, will they be increasing the amount of nurses on some floors in some hospitals?
Sir, the federal government has no control over the staffing of hospitals under provincial rule.
That's right. All we can do is
all you can do is supply money.
Well, we can have incentives to encourage provinces to do that.
Go ahead from Prince George.
Yeah, good morning. You're talking about you were talking about $4 hospital charges. Well, it's now $10 when you go into an emergency, and if you don't have the money when you arrive there, they charge you another $5 to bill you, so now you cost $15.
Which hospital are you talking about?
Prince George General.
Did it happen to you?
It happened to me last week. Twice we went in. My son hurt himself wrestling while he was for the Olympic team, and it cost us $15, and then it cost me another $15.
Well, you see, there's a good example.
Another $15 to get the cast off.
Just a minute. The rate was $10 because you didn't have the money with you to give them an extra $5?
Yeah.
$15. The hospital charge here is emergency is $10 according to my notes.
Right.
But that's what we want to stop. That's what the federal Liberal government wants to stop with the Canada Health Act. We want these user charges to do away with.
Get zapped for being poor or being unemployed.
That's right.
I'm afraid you're right in that one, old chap. 100% right.
You see, when I talk about the risk, you're right. Mr. Webster was saying a while ago that there can be misuse. I agree. It's all a question of how much you want to risk, the function of the risk in society of having a person like the caller having his son hurt, and if he happens to be unemployed, that his son can be hurt for the rest of his life because maybe he didn't have the money.
There is not a hospital in British Columbia that would dare to refuse treatment because you didn't have the $10 with you.
That's not the issue. The issue is that because...
Now they're going to... I asked them if I couldn't pay the bill, what they're going to do, and they said, well, we'll send the bill collector after you.
Yeah, but let alone that question, the danger is that father may not go to the hospital because he thinks he has to pay $10. That's the danger.
A very good point to demonstrate your case right at the very end of the program. I'm grateful to the present here this morning of Herb Breau, health proponent of Monique's bill, Liberal MP from Gloucester, Nova Scotia. It seems a very nice guy. New Brunswick. I've done it again. Thank you, Herb. Send Monique around soon, will you?
Sure, she was here not long ago.
Yeah, but she wouldn't come on the program.
Well, I'll recommend that she comes.
Nag. I'll be back after the break. Pez is supposed to be here tomorrow morning. Maybe he won't make it. Pierre De Bane off the top on the fisheries problems in BC. He's the minister at 9 a.m. precisely.